September 12th, 1683. You are standing on a hilltop outside Vienna, watching the largest cavalry charge in human history thunder down the slopes toward you. 18,000 horsemen, led by a Polish king who should have stayed home, are about to crash into your lines like an avalanche of steel and fury. You command 80,000 Ottoman soldiers, veterans who have conquered half of Europe. You have the best artillery in the world. You have numerical superiority. You have been winning this war for 2 months straight. But in 3 hours, your army will cease to exist. Your cannons will be silent. Your banners will be trampled in the mud. And the Polish king you mocked as a relic of the past will stand in your command tent, drinking your coffee, reading your letters, and wondering how it all went so catastrophically wrong. This is the Battle of Vienna. This is the day King Jan Sobieski and his Winged Hussars shattered the Ottoman dream of conquering Europe. This is the story of how 3 hours of violence saved Western civilization and turned the tide of history forever. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The Ottomans weren't supposed to lose. They had every advantage. Better logistics, better artillery, better position. Vienna was on its knees, ready to surrender. The Holy Roman Empire was paralyzed with fear. Nobody was coming to save Christendom. Nobody except an aging Polish king who gambled everything on one desperate charge. And when that charge hit, when those 18,000 horsemen smashed into the Ottoman lines, the medieval world collided with the modern age, and the modern age lost. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand why Vienna mattered so much, you have to understand that by 1683, the Ottoman Empire was the superpower of the age. They had conquered Constantinople. They had dominated the Mediterranean. They had pushed deep into Europe, swallowing Hungary, threatening Poland, and making the Holy Roman Empire look like a paper tiger. The Sultan in Istanbul wasn't just a king. He was the shadow of God on earth, commanding armies that made European monarchs wake up screaming at night. At the head of this juggernaut stood Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. This was a man who didn't just dream big. He dreamed apocalyptically. Mustafa looked at a map of Europe and saw unfinished business. Constantinople had fallen to the Ottomans in 1453. Now, 230 years later, Mustafa wanted the other prize, Vienna. He wanted to complete what Suleiman the Magnificent had failed to do in 1529. He wanted to stand at the gates of the Holy Roman Empire's eastern capital and kick them down. Mustafa wasn't a reckless fool. He was a calculating politician who understood that conquering Vienna would accomplish 3 things at once. First, it would secure Ottoman control of Hungary permanently. Second, it would open the road to the soft underbelly of Germany. Third, and most importantly, it would cement his own power in Istanbul. A Grand Vizier who delivered Vienna to the Sultan would be untouchable. The wealth alone would be staggering. Vienna was one of the richest cities in Europe, packed with gold, art, and plunder that would make the conquest of Constantinople look like a warm-up act. So in March of 1683, Mustafa began assembling the largest Ottoman army ever sent into Europe. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Contemporary sources claim anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 men. Modern historians scale that back to around 150,000 combat troops, plus tens of thousands of support personnel. Even at the conservative estimate, this was a mobile city. The baggage train alone stretched for miles. Thousands of camels carried supplies. Hundreds of artillery pieces rolled on heavy wagons. The Sultan's own tent, a massive silk pavilion, required 600 men just to erect it. This army was a multinational force. At its core were the Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers trained from childhood to be the finest infantry in the world. They wore distinctive white felt hats and carried matchlock muskets that could punch through armor at 100 yards. Supporting them were the Sipahi, the feudal cavalry of the empire, armored horsemen who held land in exchange for military service. Then came the irregular forces, Tatars from the Crimea, light cavalry who specialized in raiding and terror, Wallachians and Moldavians, Christian vassals forced to fight for their Ottoman masters. And finally, thousands of camp followers, engineers, miners, and sappers who would dig the trenches and tunnels needed to bring down Vienna's walls. The march began in spring. Mustafa moved slowly, methodically, like a python swallowing its prey. He crossed the Hungarian plain, pausing to accept the surrender of fortresses that knew better than to resist. By early July, the army reached the outskirts of Vienna. The city, nestled on the southern bank of the Danube, looked vulnerable. Its walls were old-fashioned, built in an earlier age, before gunpowder artillery became a science. The garrison inside numbered only 15,000 men, a mix of Austrian regulars, German mercenaries, and hastily armed citizens. They were commanded by Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a professional soldier who knew exactly how desperate his situation was. Starhemberg watched the Ottoman army spread out before his walls like a dark tide. He counted the banners. He counted the cannons. He did the mathematics. 15,000 defenders against 150,000 attackers. The odds were 10 to 1. Vienna should have fallen in a week. But Starhemberg had one advantage that Mustafa couldn't see from outside the walls. He had time. The city had been preparing for this moment for months. They had stockpiled food. They had reinforced the walls with earth to absorb cannonballs. They had dug inner defensive lines so that even if the walls fell, the fight would continue street by street. Most importantly, they had hope. Word had spread that relief was coming. The Holy Roman Emperor had fled, yes, but he hadn't given up. He was rallying an army. And, somewhere to the north, beyond the Danube, the Poles were marching. Mustafa didn't care about any of that. He looked at Vienna and saw a siege, not a battle. Sieges were a science. You surround the city. You cut off supplies. You dig trenches to get close to the walls. You mine under the fortifications and blow them up. You pound the defenses with artillery until gaps appear. Then you storm through those gaps with overwhelming numbers and take everything inside. It was a formula that had worked 1,000 times before. Why would Vienna be any different? On July 14th, the Ottoman artillery opened fire. The bombardment was constant, methodical, designed to grind down the defenders' will. Day after day, cannonballs smashed into the ancient walls. Night after night, miners dug tunnels beneath the bastions, packing them with gunpowder and collapsing sections of the defenses. The defenders fought back with desperate courage. They countermined, digging their own tunnels to intercept the Ottomans underground. When the two sides met beneath the earth, they fought savage battles in the darkness with knives and pistols. They repaired the walls at night, only to watch them crumble again under the next day's bombardment. Inside Vienna, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Food supplies dwindled. Disease spread through the crowded streets. The wounded filled every church and monastery. Starhemberg walked the walls every day, showing his face to the men, keeping morale from collapsing completely. He sent desperate messages to the emperor. He begged for relief. He reported that the walls were failing, that time was running out. By late August, sections of the defenses were in ruins. The Ottomans had advanced their trenches to within feet of the walls. Mustafa was preparing for the final assault. Victory seemed inevitable, but Mustafa made a critical mistake. He became obsessed with the siege. He poured all his focus, all his resources, all his attention into breaking Vienna's walls. He wanted the city to fall to his artillery and his miners, not to a general assault that would cost thousands of lives. He wanted a clean, impressive victory that would showcase Ottoman military science. And in his obsession, he made the same error that countless commanders before him had made. He forgot to watch his back. Because while Mustafa was grinding Vienna into dust, the largest relief army in European history was assembling to the north. And at its head rode a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this exact moment. Jan Sobieski was 54 years old in 1683. By the standards of his age, he was ancient for a field commander. He should have been sitting in his palace in Warsaw, drinking wine and writing his memoirs. Instead, he was riding at the head of an army, preparing to gamble his kingdom on a single throw of the dice. To understand why, you have to understand who Jan Sobieski was. He wasn't born a king. He was born a nobleman, a member of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's warrior elite. From childhood, he had been raised in the saddle. He had fought Cossacks, he had fought Swedes, he had fought Tatars, and most importantly, he had fought Ottomans. Sobieski knew the enemy better than any man alive. In 1673, 10 years before Vienna, he had commanded Polish forces at the Battle of Kotin, where he shattered a massive Ottoman invasion of Poland. That victory had made him a national hero and propelled him to the throne. For 10 years, King Jan had ruled Poland with one obsession: preparing for the day when the Ottomans would come again. He modernized his army. He studied Ottoman tactics. He trained his cavalry to be the finest shock troops in Europe, and he waited. When news reached Warsaw that the Ottomans were besieging Vienna, Sobieski didn't hesitate. He called his nobles together and made his case. If Vienna falls, Poland is next. We fight them there or we fight them here. But if we fight them there, we fight alongside allies. If we wait, we fight alone. It was brutal logic and it worked. The Polish Sejm, normally a fractious mess of bickering aristocrats, voted to declare war on the Ottoman Empire. Sobieski began mobilizing immediately. But there was a problem. Poland was exhausted. The treasury was empty. The army was small, perhaps 25,000 men at full strength. Sobieski couldn't save Vienna alone. He needed allies, and allies were hard to find. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold was willing to fight, but his forces were scattered and poorly led. The German princes were terrified of Ottoman reprisals and hesitant to commit troops. Even the Pope, who should have been leading a crusade, was offering prayers instead of soldiers. Sobieski didn't wait for consensus. He sent messengers galloping across Europe. He negotiated. He cajoled. He shamed reluctant princes into action. Slowly, painfully, an army began to form. Charles of Lorraine, the emperor's best general, rallied the Austrian forces. German contingents arrived from Bavaria, Saxony, and Franconia. By late August, the relief army numbered around 65,000 men. It was nowhere near enough to match the Ottoman numbers, but it was something. The march to Vienna was a nightmare of logistics. Sobieski pushed his men hard, covering hundreds of miles in brutal summer heat. The Polish cavalry rode ahead, scouting the route. The infantry followed, exhausted and footsore. Supply wagons broke down. Horses died. Men deserted. But Sobieski drove them forward with the force of his personality. He rode among his troops, joking with common soldiers, sharing their hardships. He promised them glory. He promised them plunder. He promised them that history would remember what they were about to do. By early September, the relief army reached the Wienerwald, the Vienna Woods, a heavily forested region of hills to the northwest of the city. From the heights, they could see Vienna burning. They could see the Ottoman siege lines. They could see the massive encampment spread out before the walls. It looked overwhelming. Charles of Lorraine, who commanded the Austrian forces, took one look and suggested negotiation. Sobieski refused. He had traveled 500 miles for this moment. He wasn't going home empty-handed. On September 11th, the relief army descended from the Wienerwald and began deploying on the slopes overlooking the Ottoman positions. Sobieski took personal command. He placed the Germans and Austrians on the left. He kept the Poles on the right, nearest to the city. The position was strong. The Christian forces occupied the high ground, looking down on the Ottoman camp, but they were still outnumbered. The Ottomans had at least 80,000 combat-effective troops, even after months of siege casualties. The Christians had 65,000 exhausted men who had just completed a forced march. That night, Sobieski walked among his troops. He spoke to the Polish cavalry, the hussars who would lead the charge. These men were legends. They wore eagle wings attached to their backs that whistled and roared as they charged, creating a sound that terrified enemies. They carried lances 18 feet long. They wore armor that made them look like angels of death. They were the finest heavy cavalry in the world, and they knew it. Sobieski told them what he expected. Tomorrow, we charge. Tomorrow, we break them. Tomorrow, we save Europe. In the Ottoman camp, Mustafa received reports of the Christian army's arrival with something close to contempt. He had spent 2 months digging trenches and building fortifications. His position was strong. His artillery was superior. His numbers were greater. If the Christians wanted to attack downhill into prepared positions, let them come. They would break themselves on Ottoman steel, just like every other Christian army for the past 300 years. Mustafa ordered his commanders to prepare defensive positions. He kept his janissaries close to the siege lines, ready to storm Vienna if the defenders tried to sally out. He positioned his artillery to enfilade any attack. Everything was in place. Victory was certain. What Mustafa didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly have understood, was that Jan Sobieski wasn't planning to fight a normal battle. He wasn't going to probe and skirmish and maneuver. He was going to do something insane. He was going to charge 80,000 men with 18,000 cavalry in a single coordinated hammer blow. It was tactically reckless. It violated every principle of siege warfare. It should have been suicide. But Sobieski had studied the ground. He had studied the enemy, and he knew something that Mustafa had forgotten. The Ottomans weren't expecting a battle. They were expecting a siege. Their artillery was pointed at Vienna, not at the hills. Their trenches faced inward, not outward. Their cavalry was dispersed, guarding the flanks and raiding the countryside. They were configured for defense, not for a pitched battle. And Sobieski was about to exploit that fatal mistake with a violence that would echo through the centuries. September 12th, 1683, dawned clear and bright. The Christian forces attended Mass at dawn, thousands of men kneeling in the grass as priests moved among them offering blessings. Sobieski himself took communion, then mounted his horse. He wore the armor of a Polish magnate, burnished steel, inlaid with gold. At his side hung a saber that had killed more men than most soldiers ever saw in battle. He raised his hand and the army began to move. The plan was simple but required perfect coordination. The Germans and Austrians under Charles of Lorraine would attack first, descending from the left to engage the Ottoman forces and draw them into battle. Once the Ottomans were committed, once they had shifted troops to meet this threat, Sobieski would unleash the Polish cavalry in a charge from the right. It was a 1-2 punch designed to shatter the enemy before they could organize a proper defense. The German infantry began their advance at 9 in the morning. They marched down the slopes in dense formations, drums beating, colors flying. The Ottomans, surprised by the sudden assault, scrambled to redeploy. Janissaries rushed to form defensive lines. Artillery crews swung their guns around to face the new threat. For hours, the battle became a grinding, bloody slog. The Germans pushed forward, taking casualties from Ottoman musket fire and cannonballs. The Austrians on the flank struggled through rough terrain, slowed by vineyards and ditches. Charles of Lorraine, watching his men die, sent urgent messages to Sobieski. "We need the cavalry. We need them now." But Sobieski waited. He sat on his horse, watching the battle develop, ignoring the pleas for help. He knew what he was doing. He was letting the Ottomans commit their reserves. He was letting them bunch up, thinking they were winning. He was setting the trap. And when he saw Ottoman cavalry moving to envelop the German left, when he saw the Janissaries advancing confidently to push the Christians back, he knew the moment had arrived. He turned to his hussars. He pointed at the Ottoman camp spread out below them, and he gave the order that would change history. "Naprzód," he said. Forward, 18,000 Polish cavalry began to move. The charge didn't start as a gallop. It started as a walk. The Polish cavalry descended from the Kahlenberg heights in perfect formation. Lances raised, wings rustling in the breeze. They moved like a slow-motion avalanche, a wall of steel and horseflesh covering the hillside. At their head rode Sobieski himself, his personal banner snapping in the wind. Behind him came the cream of Polish nobility, men who had spent their entire lives training for war, and behind them came the hussars, the elite of the elite, warriors whose mere appearance on the battlefield could break enemy morale. As they descended, the pace increased. The walk became a trot. The trot became a canter. The ground began to shake. The famous hussar wings, made of eagle and goose feathers attached to wooden frames mounted on the cavalry's backs, began to whistle and roar as air rushed through them. It was a sound unlike anything else in warfare, a rising scream that announced death was coming. Ottoman soldiers in the camp looked up and saw the horizon turning into a wave of approaching cavalry. Some broke immediately, dropping their weapons and running. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. The Ottomans tried to respond. Cavalry units wheeled to face the threat. Artillery crews loaded canister shot, essentially giant shotgun blasts designed to tear through massed formations. Janissaries formed defensive squares, muskets raised. But they were too late. They had been focused on the Germans to their left. They had been celebrating what they thought was a successful defense. And now, from their exposed right flank, 18,000 elite cavalry were thundering toward them at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour. When the charge hit, it hit like the hand of God. The impact of thousands of armored horses and riders crashing into infantry lines at full gallop is almost impossible to describe. Men were simply trampled. Horses weighing half a ton, moving at full speed, don't stop when they hit a human body. They go through it. The 18-foot lances of the hussars punched through shields, through armor, through men. A single lance strike could impale 2 soldiers at once. And when the lances shattered, the hussars drew their sabers and became a cutting machine. The Ottoman right flank didn't break. It disintegrated. Entire units ceased to exist in seconds. The Sipahi cavalry, caught in the middle of redeploying, were scattered like leaves in a storm. The infantry formations, already engaged with the Germans, suddenly found themselves attacked from behind. Panic is contagious in battle, and this panic spread like wildfire. Ottoman soldiers who had been fighting confidently minutes before suddenly realized they were surrounded. The Christians they had been pushing back were now advancing with renewed fury. And from the side, an unstoppable wave of cavalry was cutting through their formations like a scythe through wheat. Sobieski didn't stop. The charge kept going, driving deeper into the Ottoman camp. The hussars burst through the first line, through the second, through the artillery positions. Ottoman gunners abandoned their cannons and ran. Supply wagons were overturned. Tents were trampled. What had been an organized military camp became a scene of utter chaos. And still the Poles came, their blood up, their horses foaming, their sabers rising and falling in a rhythm of death. Mustafa, watching from his command position near Vienna's walls, couldn't believe what he was seeing. His right flank had simply vanished. His carefully prepared defensive positions were being overrun. His artillery, which should have been slaughtering the attackers, was silent or destroyed. And worst of all, the charge wasn't slowing down. The Polish cavalry was driving straight toward his command tent, toward the center of his power. The Grand Vizier tried to rally his troops. He sent his personal guard, the most elite janissaries, to stop the breakthrough. They formed a defensive line around his tent, muskets raised. When the Poles reached them, there was a brief, savage firefight. Musket balls tore through Polish armor. Hussars fell from their horses. For a moment, it looked like the Ottoman center might hold. But Sobieski, seeing the resistance, personally led a second wave of cavalry directly at the janissary line. The impact was catastrophic. The janissaries, magnificent infantry soldiers, were simply overwhelmed by the weight and speed of the charge. They broke, they ran, and when the Ottoman elite ran, everyone else followed. Mustafa fled for his life. He abandoned his command tent, his treasure, his correspondence, his battle plans. He scrambled onto a horse and galloped south, surrounded by a handful of loyal guards. Behind him, the Polish cavalry poured into his camp. They captured the Grand Vizier's personal standard. They seized hundreds of artillery pieces. They freed Christian slaves who had been chained in the camp. And they took plunder that would make them wealthy for the rest of their lives. The charge had lasted 3 hours from start to finish. 3 hours from the moment Sobieski gave the order until the moment the Ottoman army ceased to exist as a fighting force. In that time, 18,000 cavalry had broken 80,000 infantry and cavalry. The kill ratio was staggering. Ottoman casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. Christian losses were measured in the hundreds. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. It was Cannae in reverse, except this time it was the cavalry doing the slaughtering and the infantry being destroyed. Inside Vienna, the defenders watched in disbelief as the Ottoman army disintegrated before their eyes. The siege lines, which had been constricting them for 2 months, suddenly emptied. Ottoman soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. Count Starhemberg, tears streaming down his face, ordered the gates opened. His exhausted garrison poured out to join the pursuit. The city, which had been hours away from surrender, was saved. Sobieski didn't stop to celebrate. He rode through the captured Ottoman camp, taking in the scale of his victory. The treasure alone was beyond comprehension. The Grand Vizier's tent, a massive silk pavilion large enough to hold hundreds of men, was filled with gold, jewels, and priceless carpets. The Ottoman artillery park contained 300 cannons, abandoned intact. Supply depots held enough food to feed Vienna for months, and scattered across the battlefield were 30,000 enemy dead. Their bodies, testimony to the fury of the Polish charge. That evening, Sobieski rode into Vienna. The population, starving and traumatized, poured into the streets to greet him. They kissed his hands. They wept. They proclaimed him the savior of Christendom. Sobieski, exhausted and blood-spattered, dismounted and walked to the cathedral. There he knelt before the altar and said a simple prayer. Venimus vidimus Deus visit. We came, we saw, God conquered. It was a play on Julius Caesar's famous boast, but with a critical difference. Sobieski gave the credit to God, not to himself. It was an act of humility that cemented his reputation as not just a great commander, but a great man. But the story doesn't end with the victory. In fact, the victory created as many problems as it solved. The aftermath of the Battle of Vienna revealed the brutal politics of 17th century Europe. Sobieski had just saved Western civilization. He had broken the greatest military machine on earth. He had done what no Christian commander had managed in centuries. And his reward? Suspicion, jealousy, and betrayal. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold, who had fled Vienna before the siege and left his capital to die, returned after the battle to claim credit. When Sobieski arrived to meet him, Leopold kept him waiting for hours. A deliberate insult. When they finally met, Leopold offered the bare minimum of thanks before turning his attention to securing his own position. The emperor didn't want a powerful ally. He wanted a grateful subject. Sobieski, who had risked his kingdom and his life, found himself sidelined in the victory celebrations. The German princes were even worse. They looked at the battlefield and saw not a Christian triumph, but Polish expansion. If Sobieski was this powerful, what would stop him from turning south and conquering German territory? Old rivalries and fears resurfaced immediately. Instead of using the momentum to drive the Ottomans out of Europe, the Christian coalition began to fracture. Sobieski wanted to pursue the retreating Ottoman army. He urged the Allies to push south, to liberate Hungary, to strike while the enemy was reeling. It was the correct strategic move. The Ottomans were in chaos. Mustafa had fled to Belgrade, where he would soon be executed by the Sultan for his failure. The road to Constantinople was open, but the Germans refused. They had gotten what they wanted. Vienna saved and the immediate threat removed. Continuing the war would cost money and lives. Better to negotiate, to consolidate, to return to business as usual. Frustrated and bitter, Sobieski led his army back to Poland. The journey home was a triumph. Every town and village turned out to greet the returning heroes. The Hussars, loaded with Ottoman plunder, were celebrated as saviors. Sobieski himself entered Warsaw to scenes of jubilation. But behind the celebrations, the king knew the truth. He had won the battle but lost the peace. The Holy Roman Empire, which owed him everything, had given him nothing. The alliances he had forged were already crumbling. And worst of all, his own nobles, always suspicious of royal power, were already plotting to limit his authority. The Battle of Vienna had exhausted Poland. The campaign had drained the treasury. The cavalry had suffered losses that would take years to replace, and the geopolitical situation hadn't fundamentally changed. Poland was still wedged between powerful neighbors. The Ottomans to the south, Russia to the east, Sweden to the north, and the Holy Roman Empire to the west. Sobieski had bought time, but he hadn't bought security. The king spent his remaining years trying to consolidate his legacy. He pushed for military reforms. He tried to strengthen the monarchy. He negotiated alliances. But he was fighting against the tide. The Polish political system, the Golden Liberty, gave enormous power to the nobility and very little to the king. Every reform was blocked. Every initiative was sabotaged. Sobieski, who had commanded armies with absolute authority, found himself unable to command his own country. Jan Sobieski died in 1696, 13 years after his greatest victory. He died frustrated, knowing that Poland was weakening while its neighbors grew stronger. Within a century of his death, Poland would cease to exist, carved up by Russia, Prussia, and Austria in a series of brutal partitions. The nation that had saved Europe would itself be destroyed by European greed. But the Battle of Vienna's impact echoed far beyond Poland's borders. The Ottoman Empire never recovered. Mustafa's failure broke the spell of Ottoman invincibility. Within a few years, Austrian and German forces launched a counteroffensive that would drive the Ottomans out of Hungary permanently. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formalized what the Battle of Vienna had begun. The Ottoman Empire was in retreat. The balance of power in Eastern Europe had fundamentally shifted. Culturally, the victory became legendary. Sobieski was celebrated across Catholic Europe as the savior of Christendom. Paintings and engravings depicted the charge of the Hussars as a scene from an epic poem. Churches commissioned artworks showing Sobieski kneeling in victory. The Pope minted commemorative coins. Even Protestant nations, which had no love for Catholic Poland, acknowledged the significance of the triumph. The battle also marked a turning point in military history. The age of the cavalry charge was entering its final century. Within a few decades, improvements in infantry firearms and artillery would make massed cavalry charges suicidal. But Vienna was the last great victory of heavy cavalry, a final demonstration that shock tactics, properly employed, could still win battles. The Hussars had achieved what the French gendarmes had failed to do at Cerignola nearly 200 years earlier. They had turned tactical shock into strategic victory. There's a footnote to this story that deserves mention. Among the plunder captured from the Ottoman camp were hundreds of sacks of strange beans that the Turks used to make a bitter black drink. The Viennese, curious about these spoils, experimented with brewing the beans and discovered they produced a stimulating beverage. Thus, according to legend, Vienna's famous coffee house culture was born from the Battle of Vienna. Whether or not this story is literally true, the symbolism is perfect. The Ottomans brought coffee to Vienna as conquerors. The Viennese turned it into an institution that would define their city. It was cultural victory added to military triumph. Today, if you visit Vienna, you can walk the path of Sobieski's charge. The Kahlenberg Heights still overlook the city. A small church at the summit commemorates the victory. The battlefield itself is covered by suburban development now, houses and streets where hussars once thundered. But on September 12th every year, historical societies and military enthusiasts gather to remember the day when 18,000 cavalry saved Europe. They reenact the charge, though at considerably slower speeds and with considerably less bloodshed. They read Sobieski's letters, which survive in archives, and they ponder the what-ifs. What if Sobieski had stayed home? What if the Polish Sejm had refused to declare war? What if Leopold had successfully negotiated a separate peace with the Ottomans? What if Mustafa had kept his cavalry concentrated, instead of dispersing them? What if the Ottomans had finished Vienna before the relief army arrived? Any of these changes would have resulted in Ottoman victory. Vienna would have fallen. The Holy Roman Empire would have been forced to cede Hungary permanently and possibly more. The Ottomans would have had a secure base for further conquest into Germany. The entire trajectory of European history would have been altered. But none of those things happened. Instead, an aging Polish king gambled everything on a single charge. He took 18,000 cavalry and aimed them at the heart of an empire. And for 3 glorious, terrible hours, his gamble paid off. The charge that saved Vienna was tactically brilliant, strategically decisive, and impossibly brave. It was the kind of moment that happens once in a century, when courage and competence and luck align perfectly to create a miracle. Sobieski himself understood the magnitude of what had happened. In his letters to his beloved wife Maryshinka, written in the days after the battle, he oscillated between triumph and exhaustion. He described the horrors of the fighting, the piles of enemy dead, the narrow escapes. He worried about his soldiers. He fretted about politics. And he wondered, with the wisdom of a man who had seen too much war, whether the victory would be worth the cost. History answered his question with a resounding yes. The Battle of Vienna was worth it. It stopped the Ottoman advance cold. It saved Vienna, and by saving Vienna, it saved the Holy Roman Empire. It broke the psychological hold the Ottomans had over European imagination. It proved that the supposedly invincible Turk could be beaten decisively by coordinated Christian forces, and it gave birth to a legend that would inspire generations. But perhaps more importantly, the battle demonstrated something fundamental about warfare and history. Size doesn't guarantee victory. The Ottomans had 80,000 men, superior position, better artillery, and months of preparation. They should have won. But they faced a commander who understood that battles are won in the mind before they're won on the field. Sobieski saw that the Ottomans were configured for siege warfare, not for pitched battle. He saw that their numerical advantage meant nothing if they couldn't deploy it effectively. And he saw that one decisive blow, properly timed and executed with overwhelming force at the critical point, could shatter an army regardless of its size. The lesson of Vienna is that in warfare, as in life, there are moments when hesitation is death and boldness is life. Sobieski could have waited. He could have maneuvered. He could have avoided the decisive battle and preserved his army. But he didn't. He charged. He committed everything to a single moment of violence. And because he did, Europe survived. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the hills outside Vienna, where 18,000 horsemen changed the world in 3 hours. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle of Vienna and the charge that saved Christian Europe, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel survive the algorithm. Make sure you're subscribed and have the bell notification turned on so you don't miss our next documentary. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Sobieski gets enough credit for his role in European history? Was this really the turning point against Ottoman expansion, or would the empire have declined anyway? Let's discuss it down below. Until next time, remember, history is not just about what happened. It's about who survived to tell the story.